My name is Sridhar Parsi. I'm the president of the National Iranian American Council. I would like to say welcome to everyone here in the room and everyone who is watching on Facebook Live our conversation today. It's now been a week since Donald Trump shocked the world and managed to win the presidency. And we thought time has arrived now, a week later, to have a conversation about what we think would be valuable for the next president to do on Iran. Admittedly, when we gathered 15 of the experts behind this report in August of this year to begin drafting this, we did not do so with any degree of certainty that Donald Trump would be the president that would be receiving these recommendations. But what we had done was that we looked around and we saw that in the think tank world in Washington, we felt that not enough was being done to see what can be done to expand on this historic opportunity that has been created by the nuclear deal. On the contrary, too many reports, in our view, took a far more limited approach and focused on how we could re-up confrontational approaches vis-a-vis Iran in the areas outside of the nuclear realm. We thought that a much bolder policy, one that was premised on the following points, is warranted. First, the nuclear deal has been a significant net benefit for U.S. national interest and regional stability. Today, we're not hearing talk about war with Iran or talk about Iran advancing towards a nuclear weapon. And that is a direct result of the nuclear deal. Second, if the most entrenched issue between the United States and Iran could be resolved without a single fire being shot diplomatically, we believe that it then is also worthwhile to entertain the idea and explore the opportunities to be able to resolve the many other remaining points of tension between the United States and Iran through diplomacy as well. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, mindful of Iran's size and weight in the region, we believe that it squarely lies in the interest of the United States to reduce tensions with Iran further, and where possible, when the interests are overlapping, explore opportunities to collaborate, to advance the U.S. interests. Thus, as a group led by our research director, Reza Marashi, as the group prepared this report, we did not prepare two versions. There is another PDF of this report, and the only difference is that it has the name Hillary Clinton on it and a picture of her. But other than that, it is identical. And the reason for that is that while so much in Washington has changed in this last week, and a lot more will continue to change as a result of the presidential elections, one thing has not changed at all, and that is U.S. national interest. U.S. national interest remains such that it needs to reduce tensions with Iran and find ways to build on this nuclear deal regardless of who won this election. And that is why we didn't prepare two different reports. Now, this report is endorsed by 76 of the nation's most foremost national security scholars and former officials, and we're delighted to have several of them with us here today to discuss the report, its conclusions, and how we think they can be put into effect. We're also very delighted to have with us here Steve Clemons, the editor-at-large of The Atlantic, a national journal, who is one of the sharpest minds in Washington, D.C., thinking about these issues. He will lead and moderate this discussion. Before I hand it over to Steve, though, I do want to also take the opportunity to thank the foundations who have made this project possible. We are immensely grateful to Pivotal Foundation, ARCA Foundation, the Telemarcus Foundation, as well as private donations from the Iranian American community that made this project possible. Without their support, we would not be able to be here today to share our ideas and recommendations. So I hand it over to Steve. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Trita. It's good to be with all of you this morning. We have a fantastic panel. Just to my left, John Mearsheimer, who is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science, co-director of the program on international security policy at the University of Chicago, probably America's most famous intellectual realist. So very interesting and great to have you here. We have Sanam Naragi-Anderlini as co-founder and executive director of the International Civil Society Action Network and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University as well. And I guess between 2005 and 2014, and you helped draft this report as well. Of course, we have Andrew Bacevich as professor of international relations and history at Boston University, also a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy. I neglected to mention that for John Mearsheimer. So two gentlemen who grew up in the military establishment intellectually and are now very well placed to critique and help define the direction that we go. His most recent book was America's War for the Greater Middle East, A Modern History. And then we have, as Trita just mentioned, Reza Marashi as National Iranian American Council's Research Director. And I understand you were the lead drafter of this report. And so I am very amused by the photo of this with endtheirandeal.com being your lead photo on this report. I don't know if all of you have seen this, but it's definitely provocative. Can you just very quickly walk us through what you think are the biggest nuggets of the report that you're issuing today?
Absolutely, and thank all four of you very, very much for joining us this morning, and all of you. We're thrilled to have you here. And you know, not a lot of us thought that we would be having this conversation centered around a Trump presidency. I would add that I did, and I wrote about it in June, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, we have a report out now, as Trita mentioned, recommendations being made. It doesn't matter if it's a Republican or a Democrat, because core U.S. national interests remain the same. I can't unpack every single recommendation in the report for you, because then you wouldn't read it, but I can highlight a couple of important ones that I think stand out. First and foremost, on U.S.-Iran relations, we emphasize that it is in the American national interest for President-elect Trump to reiterate to the Iranian government, both publicly and privately, that it intends to fulfill the commitments made outlined in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Making that kind of public declaration, but also emphasizing it privately to the Iranians through the channels of communication that have been established, is going to be critical to not only continuing the lifespan of the JCPOA, but also making sure that the channels of communication that have been opened continue and have the potential to grow should the president make that decision. Also, there are points of tension that will continue outside of the JCPOA within U.S.-Iran relations. And we advise that it is in the American national interest for President-elect Trump to conduct a full-scale review of, for example, the threat that Iran's ballistic missile program poses to U.S. national interests. Because at the end of the day, if you have a nuclear program where a ceiling has been established that it can't go beyond a certain point, then perhaps a ballistic missile program changes the threat perception of the United States, and perhaps as opposed to being considered an offensive capability, it becomes a defensive capability, and so things can change, and subsequently conversations can change about points of tension in U.S.-Iran relations. One other thing that stands out in this report, as it pertains to policy recommendations, the Saudi-Iran Cold War. We argue in this report that de-escalating tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia is the linchpin that will unlock additional peaceful processes that can help fulfill U.S. national interests in the region. We also point out that the U.S. can't do this alone. There's no silver bullet, there's no magic wand that the U.S. can wave that can de-escalate Saudi-Iran tensions. But U.S. leadership, combined with partnership with traditional partners not only in the region but also in Europe, Asia, and elsewhere, can help converge the two sides together, establish channels of communication and dialogue that haven't really been happening since President Rouhani came into office in 2013, and over time can de-escalate tensions to the point that we saw in the early to mid 2000s. So this is just a small taste of the kinds of things that we have outlined in this report. And again, every single policy recommendation that we have is predicated not in terms of what is politically convenient, but what is in the American national interest that trumps partisan politics.
Let me just ask you to drill down into one other element here. When you look at the JCPOA and what might proceed, I'm interested in the mechanics of how it might fall apart. Let's not put the best case on the table, let's take the worst case. Recently, Secretary Kerry told me that in the management of the JCPOA, there are very frequent times where there are implementation questions, there are disputes and differences. The IRGC is on the edge of this, trying to screw things up now and then. And so it is it's sort of a full-time job, both for himself and Ernie Moniz, to sort of tend to issues that come up. And I've been interested in the transition, whether it was Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, whether there would be that same commitment and kind of an earnest effort to actually work those issues. And couldn't you end up in a situation where Iran's failure at some level to follow through on one of these elements that are being tended and managed by Kerry and Moniz today, they could end up on their end being perceived as the ones that have ended the JCPOA process?
Steve, that's a great question, and I can't emphasize enough exactly how important this is. The JCPOA is like the engine inside of a car. If you have an engine inside of a car and you don't add motor oil, eventually things become corrosive and the engine breaks down. The JCPOA needs motor oil, and that motor oil is continued dialogue, not just on the JCPOA to manage and upkeep the deal, but also on additional points of tension.
Right.
Because if all you're doing is focusing on the deal, but you're not at least trying to resolve tensions on other issues, eventually that tension on outside issues seeps into the JCPOA. So, just really, really quickly, I would say there's two things that stand out to me. One, whether or not Trump can sustain a veto on potential sanctions that come through Congress, because the Republicans still have a majority and they're certainly going to try. So it remains to be seen on that front. And also, I think the agreed framework in 1994 with the North Koreans, the nuclear deal that we have with them, is very telling. A Democratic administration had it in place. They put a lot of time and effort into upkeep. A Republican administration comes into office in 2001, doesn't really care for it so much, doesn't really fulfill our end of the bargain. The North Koreans then get blamed that they're not fulfilling their end of the bargain. It falls apart, things get worse.
Yeah, I think managing the deal over the next 10 to 15 years is not the crucial issue. I think it matters, but it's not the big issue in my mind. The problem with the deal is that it basically runs out after 15 years. And the question is, where are we going to be in 15 years? And the principal reason that Iran will want nuclear weapons after 15 years is because it feels threatened. That's why states want nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are the ultimate deterrent. Ehud Barak said a number of years ago that the principal reason to think that Iran is developing nuclear weapons is because it makes so much sense. He understood that from Iran's point of view, it makes sense to have nuclear weapons because Iran was threatened by the United States mainly, and also by Israel. So what you want in 10 to 15 years is a situation where Iran and the United States have good relations, and the United States is not threatening to attack Iran, because that's the best way of maximizing the likelihood that Iran will not go down the nuclear road. If relations are poisonous in 15 years, Iran is going to have very powerful incentives to acquire nuclear weapons. They'd be foolish not to. So we meaning the Americans, have a deep-seated interest in improving relations with Iran so that Iran extends this deal ad infinitum.
So let me ask you, John, we're in a time of politics and we don't know what choices Donald Trump is going to make. We're all waiting patiently to know who's going to be the next Secretary of State, next Secretary of Defense, next National Security Advisor. If that's Bob Corker, that's one direction. If it's John Bolton, whose DNA has been quite committed to regime change in Iran every time I've heard him speak, what do you think at that point is the relevance of this report, I suppose? If John Bolton is appointed Secretary of State, what signal does that send to Iran? I mean, I'm just sort of interested both in the solid proposals here, but also the practical side of this, given the leadership team that Trump might bring in.
Well, it's very hard to tell who will be in the leadership team and what they will actually do. My basic view is that any president, when he or she comes to office, can deal with 2 or 3 big issues at the same time. And Donald Trump has promised to overturn a whole slew of different policies, both domestic and international. And he is simply not going to be able to do them all at once. If he tries to undo Obamacare, that's going to involve an enormous amount of intellectual and political capital. It's going to greatly limit how much time he can spend on other domestic issues, not to mention international issues. If he decides to improve relations with Russia, that's going to cause all sorts of problems. John McCain has made it clear that he's going to fight him on that issue. So if he's dealing with the Russian issue, he's not going to have a lot of time to deal with 3 or 4 other issues, Iran included. And I would bet, given how complicated the Iranian deal is, that no matter who's advising him, they will not challenge that deal in a meaningful way. That would be my guess.
Andy and Sanam, let me both ask you a similar question. That if, as you look forward at the politics that are unfolding, one of the things I tweeted out yesterday to anybody that might be this was that Chuck Schumer was in fact a supporter of John Bolton in the past. He has had a lot of concerns. He's somebody that has support in terms of adding a renewed set of sanctions against Iran. And I'm interested from a grand strategy perspective and your own perspectives on whether or not, given this kind of weird environment that's somewhat murky, how, given what we know of Trump, do you think this could be something he sees as his Nixon goes to China moment, where he actually, amidst all of this, does embrace this, as says, okay, not only am I going to find a way to re-embrace and repivot with Russia, but in fact, all the things I've said on Iran, I'm gonna change that vector. Do you see that capacity?
So, I see it in two things. So number one, I think there's a higher level question that should be out there. And I think that this is part of the discourse we should be having in the media as well, which is, given with the limitations of the US's influence in the region, there's certainly, we can't, the US can't do everything, but given what the US can do we want a Middle East that's gonna be more chaotic than it is right now, or less chaotic? First, let's answer that question, right? Because if you want less chaos, then messing around with the Iran deal is taking you towards more chaos, right? There are enough problems in the region at the moment that we have to deal with. This one is one thing that's been, partially resolved.
Let me stop you just there for a moment, because to assert that, I actually agree with you that there's a school of thought that says we've sort of left our Sunni allies in the lurch, paranoid about the future of the region, and that actually walking away from the Iran deal or letting it explode on its own through not tending it would be reassuring, strategically reassuring to kind of core Sunni allies in the region. So I just want to have you answer that, because that would be what a critic would say.
So again, two things. Number one, I think Saudi Arabia came out a couple of days ago saying they should keep the Iran deal. So again, it's one thing what people say, under certain conditions, and then when you're suddenly seeing the whole train going down the wrong path, it's reality strikes. So we have to bear that in mind. Secondly, frankly speaking, the U.S. should not be in the business of taking a sectarian alliance. Saying our Sunni allies versus the Shia allies. This does us no good, and in fact, if you think about it, it's again we've fallen into the sort of rabbit hole of assuming that Shias and Sunnis in the world have the same power and influence. The Shias represent 15% of the world's Muslim population. The vast majority are in Iran, so there's an ethnic division between us and many others. Whereas when you think about the Sunni world and our Sunni allies, what's been happening over the last 30 years and accelerated over the last 10 to 5 years is the spread of Wahhabi Salafism around the world. So the problems of ISIS, Daesh, all the kind of terrorism problems that we're thinking about come from our supposed allies in the Gulf. It stems from that particular region, and we should be careful about who our friends really are. I mean, it's stealth sectarianism because it's soft power. It's what's been happening is the spread of this ideology, which is incredibly intolerant. It's not the majority Sunni world's version of Islam, but it's been spread through schools, universities, masses of funding, and it's growing everywhere. Take India. India has had $250 million of Saudi money spread in the last few years. They're opening four Wahhabi universities in India. Okay, now just think about what that means in a country with 1 billion people and a Hindu nationalist government coming around, right? This is what we should be worried about. That Iran, as I said, so I go back to my original point. The Iran deal is giving us a space to engage with the most stable regional power, and to broaden that, to be realistic in terms of the engagement. I'm not saying that tomorrow we're gonna be best friends, but it seems absurd not to be talking to a state which has behaved rationally for its own interests, and as you say, everybody who engages understands that, right? But it's the discourse here that has been ongoing, whether it's been a Republican or Democratic administration, say, oh, they're irrational. They're not irrational. They know exactly what they're doing. And again, you also need to look at the social space in Iran. It's a very, very different country as a population to what we have in other parts. And you don't want that turning to become radicalized either. So let's bear that in mind.
Right. Andy?
Can I return to the John Bolton issue for a moment? Remember, during the campaign, there were some number of people, I think they were mostly Hollywood celebrities, who said that if Trump won the election, they were going to move to Canada. And I really thought that was kind of a silly and foolish thing to say.
But
if John Bolton becomes Secretary of State, I will reconsider.
that's under 140 spaces as you're tweeting.
Here's my perspective, which I think is.
I mean, we're joking, but I mean, I just want to say it very seriously could happen in the next day or two. That could be
I'm a practicing Catholic, and I'm saying my prayers that it will not happen. But I guess my perspective, I think, is in sync with almost everything that has been said, but comes at it from a slightly different angle. You were very kind to mention my latest book, not to give you a hard time, but you misstated the subtitle.
Ooh.
It's not a modern history, it's a military history.
Uh-oh.
And that matters because it seems to me that the overarching theme of U.S. policy in this part of the world for several decades now is premised on the expectation that somehow or other the application of American military power can fix the problem. Whatever the problem is, however we define fix, but somehow or other, through dropping bombs or conducting raids or working through proxies or invading countries and occupying them, that American military power is going to fix things. And it hasn't. And unfortunately, in our political discourse, there has not, we have failed to identify the off-ramp or the alternative, and I think the Iran nuclear deal is that off-ramp. One of the reasons it needs to be carefully nurtured over this next decade or so is that, to the extent that first the initial aim and promise, preventing an Iranian nuclear weapon, is fulfilled, but also that the further potential of the deal is fulfilled. That there is some kind of a further opening in relations with Iran that yields some kind of a positive effect, then we begin to see that the United States of America has an alternative available, an alternative to simply more war available that can satisfy U.S. interests and arguably contribute to the restabilization of the region, which would benefit us and would benefit everybody else.
So take us a little bit further there. At the beginning of 2010, I wrote a piece for the American Interest. There were a number of us, I don't know, John, if you were one of those as well, that were to grade President Obama's foreign policy at that time. I think I gave him a C- or a D. And my line was that in grading Obama, only Iran mattered. And it wasn't clear to me that he was moving the geostrategic map to prioritize that. What's interesting is Steve Krasner really wrote pretty much the same thing in this set of articles in his own critique, and said it was very vital and important because it would be a way to show the world that America could still move the needle on significant international issues, and that is power, that actually then restores the notion that the U.S. has power and capability to be an order keeper, and that both enemies and allies would be heartened by that. And so I'm interested, and I think that jives with what you're saying, Andy, and I want to just know, why hasn't gravity taken us further there after the Iran deal was secured? Why hasn't the marketplace sort of perceived America on the upswing from that event? Because I'm not sensing it has, and by my theory, it should have.
Well, I think you need to be a little bit more patient.
Mm.
I mean, the deal has not, been in place for that long a period of time, and the period of time since it's been in place has been we've been preoccupied by this very divisive election. So I think that once again, who knows what President Trump will do, but once we get past the campaigning, then it seems to me it becomes possible to move forward. I wouldn't give President Obama a C-. I'd give him an I for incomplete, in particular with regard to this initiative.
Well, I just want to say that when I gave the grade, it was after the first year. I would give a higher, slightly higher grade later.
But my point would be is that where will we be in the region? Where will U.S.-Iranian relations be a decade from now? And that, I think, is what will, in many respects, determine the the grade he gets from historians. There are many uncertainties, and there's sort of a lot of things in motion.
John?
I think the reason he hasn't gotten that much credit on Iran is just one part of a much bigger story. And Iran is really the only success. He and his predecessor, George W. Bush, have made a total mess of the Middle East. And we could just go down the cases. Libya, Barack Obama. Syria, Barack Obama. Egypt, Barack Obama. Afghanistan, longest war in American history. We've spent more money rebuilding that country than we spend on the Marshall Plan. Not only do we have Al-Qaeda and the Taliban back, we have ISIS there now. Iraq is a total mess. In the process, we created ISIS. We broke Iraq apart. We broke Syria apart. On and on. except for Iran. He deserves an F. And this is the reason that he gets so little credit. And in fact, one of the reasons Trump won was because he was running against the foreign policy community here in Washington.
To all of you, let me ask you, I can't mention a name, but the very high-level Obama diplomat has been intimating and said very directly in certain settings that Iran has become the comfortable partner, the Saudis have become the uncomfortable ally. And that regardless of what is said publicly. And I find that fascinating, which means you have a kind of in-the-closet problem for the administration dealing with Iran. And what's interesting about this report and what it advocates, because I sat and I reread it this morning, you're really trying to drag the U.S.-Iran relationship out of the closet and say, here are all these opportunities. Whereas covertly, there seems to be at least more going on now than many people may realize. Do I have that wrong?
We have all sorts of ways that we can talk about. Yes, I mean, for a long time we used to say this was bad dating. It was now we're in.
Right.
I just want to add Yemen to the list because
Yeah.
Yemen is the war of choice of this administration, and
Right.
it's absolutely horrendous.
But the point I'm trying to get on this other issue, though, is one, as I'm fascinated by what Andy basically just said, is that this Iran deal should give an opportunity for a platform to then see what else can be done, what coordination, and then you begin to see global gravity work a little bit differently on some of these cases, whether it's Syria or Yemen or other parts. So how to move that
so
forward?
2 points. Number one, we will be sending an enormously awful, I mean, a really devastating signal to the world if we renege on this deal, right? Because it's basically the U.S. made a deal, and now we're stepping back from it. So how?
Well, we're doing that. I mean, whether you like it or not, we're doing that with TPP, for instance. I'm going to Singapore next week, and Prime Minister Lee of Singapore said, TPP was your deal. You invited us all to your party, and you just abandoned your party.
So we're going to be known as the country that you can't trust because you can't make a deal. And
we're already there, right?
Right. But this just adds, right? Yeah. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is, again, you can't say that, we passed, we made the deal and then there was garbage.
Right.
There was, from the beginning and throughout this process, there have been enormous powers against the deal, right? So they were active while the negotiations were going on, they were active when it went to Congress, and they've certainly been active either behind the scenes or covertly, ongoing, right? And they are hugely resourced, they have huge access. And we can't pretend that the deal went through and then this administration that's fallen apart. It's actually these other factors that are going on. And the question for me becomes, if you listen to part of Trump's rhetoric, that he says we want diplomacy, we don't want destruction, right? Or even on the Iran deal, this was a bad deal, we want a better deal, right? That's a very different position to the John Boltons of this world, right?
Well, even Rudy Giuliani came out yesterday and said that walking away from the Iran deal wouldn't be a priority. I mean, it was interesting.
So then if you then take it to the next level, you say he's interested in jobs in America, well, remove the sanctions, and you get all sorts of American companies being able to do business with Iran. I mean, there's a certain logic if you take that strand of his own rhetoric. It's a question of who he's going to have around him and what other forces are going to be around him. But if you take some of Trump's own language, there's not only the deal should stay, it should be that he removes the sanctions and lets middle-sized American corporations do business with Iran, because right now they can't, whereas the big multinationals are already doing it via their European subsidiaries, by the way. So it's actually American workers that are getting the raw end of
the Boeing deal.
The Boeing deal.
Reason?
Well, I think durable solutions to conflict requires the buy-in of every country with the capacity to wreck the solution. And we have traditional partners in the Middle East that have been, as Barack Obama very eloquently said, free riding. And now we're asking them to do their fair share and assuming their fair share of the burden for security in the region. And they're behaving badly, to put it diplomatically. And sometimes I try to put myself in their shoes and say, how would I react if I were the Saudis and I was getting a free deal for 25 years, dual containment? Terrible idea. How would I feel if I was the Israelis, dual containment, benefiting from that, putting very little in to the whole idea of trying to balance Iran and then previously Iraq to the Iraq War? So now you have a situation where the United States has told the Saudis, first privately, now publicly, same with the Israelis, we're trying to improve our relationship with Iran, make it more manageable. You should do the same. We can't force them to do it. And the days of zero-sum security and zero-sum politics is over. Cold War is over, and none of us should want it to come back. That's the kind of message that the Obama administration correctly has been communicating to our partners in the region. And my hope is that whoever ends up occupying the Trump administration will continue to make that similar
Has
message.
the supreme leader in Iran said anything about Trump? I don't know, but I mean, a matter that, it's sort of, Trump seems to enjoy flattery, and so you can imagine the supreme leader saying, Trump looks promising. Has anything like that been
So about a week and a half ago, I can't remember if it was right before the election or right after the election, he spoke about it. And everybody were like, oh, see, he's praising Trump and he's criticizing the United States. I don't think that's what he was doing at all.
the supreme leader? Because I don't know, what did he say?
The supreme leader. He was coming out and saying, look at all of the criticisms that he makes of the American political establishment. Look at all the criticisms that he makes of neoliberal economics. Look at all the criticisms that he makes of Pax Americana. But what he failed to mention was he's criticizing all of these things not just because his ideology is different from what we espouse, but he had somebody from 2005 to 2013 that said all of the same things and did all of the same things that Trump did, and then came into power and made his life a living hell. Where he stopped short of the analogy, but where I'm crystal clear that he was going down was, I've seen this before, and I saw what it did to my country, and I have a pretty good idea of what it could do to the United States.
We're still in.
Well, questions, but I think what he said was, the crazy person beat the liar.
Oh,
Yeah.
the crazy person beat the liar. I mean, it's useful to know, and I think Donald Trump could probably live with that. And so it's, but I actually am not trying to make light of it. It seems right now, as little as we know about what moves Donald Trump, these kinds of moments between leaders and what they've said either create opportunities or close them. We'll see how it goes. I'm interested in, Andy, in coming back to this question that you sort of laid out about what the next tier of possibilities are. Could you kind of walk us through for a minute, if we were to walk away, or to, I think there are different ways in which, it's an international arrangement, the United States could essentially stop playing, but that doesn't end the deal. It's a global deal, and the Europeans have said they would still proceed. And I'd like you to kind of talk for a minute, because we have millions of people watching on Facebook Live right now. What our
So
own
that means I should
hubris about
mention the
sanctions.
title of
because
my book again.
So sanctions. Exactly. America's War for the Greater Middle East, a military history. But to kind of look at this notion of sanctions, because sanctions as a concept, as a term, as a tool, gets bandied around a lot. And I think what's not often discussed is how sanctions don't work if you don't have the rest of the world with you. And if you did try and walk away from the rest of the deal, where would the rest of the world be if the United States, who would be isolated and who would not?
Well, we would be isolated,
Right.
I think. And when you are in this period between administrations, any discussion of what's going to happen next is speculative. It seems to me at this particular moment, it's sort of speculation primed, because we really have such difficult time understanding what makes Donald Trump tick.
But this report is trying to influence those decisions.
But what I was going to, my sense of him, I've never met the man, is that that there is a core of nationalism that will drive his approach to policy. and as others have said, a sort of a transactional perspective. What's in it for us, what's in it for them. And as a nationalist, as a business executive, I find it hard to believe that he would reach the conclusion that at some early stage of his administration, it really would be a great idea to abrogate the Iran nuclear deal. As John suggests, given the fact that he's made a multitude of promises, and there's only a certain number of them that his administration is going to be able to manage or to sell. And from a transactional basis, what do we get? What do we gain? How do we benefit? How is this going to boost my standing, either as a world leader or boost my standing in the eyes of the American people? So my guess is, regardless of what he said or the podiums that he stood behind, that he'll find a way to finesse it, and that the Iran nuclear deal will survive. It may not be nurtured with as much care as it deserves to be, but it's not going to go away.
I have met Trump a few times, and I think the way how you describe him is accurate from the little time that I've spent with him. And I think it's also important at a forum like this to remind people that during the GOP debate, he was the only Republican contender to say that he wouldn't rip up the Iran deal on the first day. He may have modified now and then somewhere else, but he actually has not. Ron Campius of the Jewish Telegraphic Agency highlighted this the other day and said that it's interesting. He's talked about redoing it. He's saying it was a bad deal, but if you're a businessman, you don't walk in and just say you're going to rip up the contract on the first day. So that's an interesting item in terms of the methodology that he may bring to these issues, despite who his advisors might be. John?
I think it's important to think about the relationship between a reset with Russia and
Yes.
a relationship with Iran.
So
Iran.
take us down the Russian force for a minute and how that looks to you.
Well, I think that it's likely, despite the opposition from John McCain, that he will try to improve relations with Russia, because it's much easier to execute than redoing the deal.
So what are the opportunities there for us, and what are the costs for us?
Well, he's got to go beyond rhetoric, and I think the three big issues that matter to the Russians are Ukraine,
Right.
Syria, and the Iran nuclear deal.
You wouldn't say Eastern Europe, sphere of influence?
Well, that's inextricably bound up with
Right.
Ukraine. I mean,
Okay.
once you solve the Ukraine issue, all of that just takes
Okay.
care of itself, in my opinion. But Ukraine has nothing to do with Iran.
Right.
But Syria does, right? If he's going to have improved relations with Russia, he's going to have to work with the Russians to settle the Syrian problem. And that means working with the Iranians, because the Iranians, the Russians, and Hezbollah are all together in Syria. So there, improving relations with Russia and dealing with Syria means he has to work with Iran. But also on the Iran nuclear deal, the Russians are deeply committed to the Iran nuclear deal. They helped negotiate it. They think it's a terrific deal. And the last thing they want to do is blow that up. And if Trump blows that up, it's going to cause him huge problems with the
An
Russians.
opportunity for Putin to sign a report?
We emailed him, got no response.
So my point is, if he moves to improve relations with Russia, which I think he's likely to do, it's going to push him in the direction of having good relations or better relations with Iran, and certainly not blowing up the deal.
Summer?
I mean, when we think about Russia, Iran, Syria,
Mm-hmm.
to me, the one, it's really no cost to us here in the U.S. The question is, what is the Syria that is going to emerge out of that, and in terms of the population that's going to be devastated further. I mean, when Russia went in with the bombs, for me it was a question of, is this going to be out of Chechnya?
Mm-hmm.
And that's certainly the way it's going. So we have to be a little bit cautious in terms of what does it mean to, on one hand, we need to sit at the table, and that the discussions need to happen with Iran and Russia and others really engaged. On the other hand, I work with a lot of Syrians, and it's a very scary prospect to feel that they're going to be handed over, and how many more deaths and displacements are going to be, or is the country going to be split up? We need, if for the Syria process, the one thing that needs to be done is to bring the voices of the 70% majority who are in the middle, who are neither regime supporters nor opposition supporters, to the table in some sort of way. And de Mistura has been doing that in the Geneva process with a civil society table, and there are lots of very effective networks and organizations. But again, the question is, do you want to think outside the box, and do you want to have a different approach, or do you want to go down the path that you've had?
Obama had 4 more years, wouldn't we be doing that anyway?
I think so.
I mean, you know, when you look at continuity and discontinuity, but John Kerry tells me that we were really within a very, very close moment of finding ourselves sitting in the room with the Russians, jointly coordinating, sending out signals. In fact, I think there'll be another proposal on the table soon that will be Russian initiated, that gives Nusra an opportunity to vacate some places. And because part of this deals then how do you deal with the Saudis and others that are supporting various elements in the opposition, but had a, you know, sort of U.S. directed and supported forces not killed 67 Syrian soldiers, we might see a different history today. So, you know, to come to your point, had Obama had, so the continuity may actually, on Russia, may not be as big a pivot as everyone thinks. I'm just,
Let's hope.
yeah, I'm wondering what way you, Andy, your thoughts on Russia?
Well, I don't think I agree with John that
I hope you
settling Ukraine sort of settles the entire sort of Eastern European thing. And I very much agree with John that one of the root causes of the tension between ourselves and Russia is the folly of NATO expansion and EU expansion up to Russia's borders. But that's happened, and one senses that even were the Ukraine situation sorted out, that doesn't make Russia any more comfortable that we've absorbed, for example, the Baltic republics into NATO. So my expectation is that there would continue to be some amount of tension, some amount of friction. I'm not trying to say that's a go-to-war sort of situation, but even sorting out the issues that John ticked off, my sense is that U.S.-Russian relations are going to continue to be rocky, and frankly, that's probably inevitable at this point. We're not going to be pals.
I just have one minute, just 2 quick points. One is that we absorbed the Baltic states in 2004. There are 3 NATO expansions, 1999, and that was Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, and then 2004, which is when the Baltic states came in. And from 2004 to 2008, the Russians had no problem with the fact that the Baltic states had been incorporated into NATO. What caused all the trouble was the April 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, where at the end we said Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO. That's what really messed things up big time. So I think the Baltic states is not that big a problem. Second point is, I was recently in Russia, I was in Moscow, and then I was at the Valdai conference where Lavrov and Putin both came and spoke. And I talked to a number of other high-level Russian officials there. There's a deep-seated concern among the Russian elite that they have to fix their economy, that it's too heavily dependent on oil. And over the long term, that means they have to spend much less money on defense. And there are a lot of Russian members of the foreign policy community who think that they're just spending too much money on defense, and picking a fight with the United States is not what you want to do. So anything that can be done to ameliorate that and allow them to plow money into the economy would be welcome. And I believe that includes Putin as well. So I think we could do a great deal to ameliorate the tension. One could argue that we've messed things up so much now that we may be right over the long term, that we can never put Humpty Dumpty back together.
There's the other side of amelioration, though. Like even if a relationship between Trump and Putin sort of leveled the tensions between the bilateral tensions, and I got to tell you, the Poles and the Lithuanians and the Estonians and the Latvians are still going to be in a panic. So even if there is no actual threat to the Baltics, there's going to have to be some mechanism for assuring what has now become the nation.
The one thing we're talking in a way about U.S. power sometimes out of necessity sounds more confident about its role in the world than I sometimes am. I'm just off a plane from Abu Dhabi in a big strategic dialogue there. There were people from all around the world, and the doubt in America's ability to be there, or likelihood of being there for them in dark times, is very high. And the sort of, if I were to have one takeaway from the strategic dialogue, is that other players in the world are thinking that it is not a smart move to count on the U.S. being their support for them, and they need to begin making other bets, other institutional arrangements that aren't quite as woven in with the U.S.
Well, that can have an upside.
Right, and that can have an upside, and it could move the U.S. into being more of an offshore balancer, which I know you've written a lot about as well, that might be healthy, actually, for a lot of these questions. But when you look at Eastern European paranoia, which I think is justified in part, it raises a lot of these questions. But let me throw one other question, which I don't see in the report. I find, love to get your thoughts on Turkey. Turkey is an ascendant, sees itself as an ascendant strategic player in the region. And I don't really know where Turkey is with regard to Iran. The kind of strategic framework advocated in this very interesting report is one that would anchor and also embrace a more ascendant Iran, trying to balance other issues there. But how do you think Turkey would respond to this, John?
Well, I think the Turks have their hands full with the Syrian crisis and with the Kurds. And given that the Iran nuclear deal is now in place, there are no meaningful problems between Turkey and Iran. And I think that's likely to remain the case for the foreseeable future. I think if Iran were to get nuclear weapons, the Turks would get nuclear weapons. And I think we understand that. That's one of the principal reasons we're so interested in shutting down the Iranian nuclear program. There are a host of other reasons as well. But I think Turkish-Iranian relations is not a really big deal at this point.
You don't think they'll fight over Iraq?
No, I don't think so.
I do, to an extent. I think Turkish-Iranian relations have similarities, though it's not identical to Iran-Saudi relations, where you're never going to see these two countries be best of friends. They're going to be either competitors or they're going to be enemies. And we saw a bit of an enemy phase start to emerge between Iran and Turkey, where both sides were fairly confrontational towards one another. And I think two things helped to de-escalate it. One was pretty significant economic linkages between the two countries that helped cooler heads prevail, but also there was an institutionalized dialogue between the Iranis and the Turks that frankly didn't exist on the Iran-Saudi side, and the Iran-Saudi side doesn't have as robust economic links as well. So the rivalry is there, the competition between them for influence in that part of the world, not just the Middle East, but much more across the map is there, and I don't think that's going to go away. But I think the competition has been codified in ways where they're able to have conversations and figure out how to pursue accordingly.
Seems like you just undercut your own argument. I mean,
not at all.
That they're either going to be enemies or they're going to be competitors, but we have dialogue and we have important economic linkages. That seems to suggest that there is a third alternative.
I think having the dialogue and the economic linkages allows for the competition so that it doesn't boil over into the rivalry. We're essentially arguing that Iran is capable of doing this. There's a variety of examples demonstrating that Iran is capable of doing this. It's in the American national interest to try and pursue it. And the argument that some of the people that are being tossed around as names to enter the Trump administration in very senior positions ideologically don't believe that we should do it or that it's possible, despite the fact that the deal and a variety of other things disprove them, because it goes against their worldview, which very distinctly breaks things into black, white, good, and evil. And I don't think the world works that way.
I want to go to the audience in a minute, but I want to, as I think about this, and I'm just reading the report, and it's really interesting that the sanctions stuff, the sanctions legislation is going to be on its way as soon as he's sworn in. And my memories of Hillary Clinton and Trump on the campaign trail talking about Iran are, Hillary, despite wanting to take some ownership of this because of the role of Jake Sullivan and others, but at the same time saying, essentially, the Iranians are going to cheat, lie, deceive. I mean, I wrote at the time on her big Iran speech, she didn't give anything that Andy Basovich just said, that there was an opportunity to actually begin looking at reinforcing positives and looking at where there would be opportunities. She didn't say that in any of the remarks that I've heard her give. Trump would say, it's crazy to send them $400 million in cash, but if we did it, let's sell them something. Or, yes, of course, with the, they're kind of $150 billion, stupid, but they've got money, we should be, of course, selling them Boeings. And so this deal maker part of Trump oddly for me is an interesting opportunity, but I'm interested in how you folks think his Republican colleagues across the lawn over there on Capitol Hill are going to deal with that, because it's not only John McCain, but a lot of people, Tom Cotton, who it may be allegedly in running for Secretary of State, are folks that have embraced this sort of cascading set of sanctions legislation that they're crafting right now. So any thoughts on that dimension,
Yeah,
Sana?
So first of all, I think if there are any Iranian Americans that voted for Trump, it's because of Hillary's rhetoric. I think it was deeply.
So I didn't misunderstand her.
No, and it was deeply insulting because she would talk about the Iranians being our enemies. It was kind of hit
Right.
home in a very harsh way. But to me, again, if there's one light that we want to try and find in this very murky world, it is that rhetoric of saying, as I said before, and then you said it. He's not saying rip up the deal. He's saying let's have a better deal. It is the sort of the businessman in him, and so I think that's the angle which we should be pursuing, because it is actually American companies that are at the moment falling behind in any of the business negotiations that are going on. Things have slowed down, obviously, because of the financial sanctions, but the Europeans are moving ahead with things, and it is, when the Clinton administration imposed the oil and gas sanctions back in 1994, a lot of Iranian businesses that had traditional relations with the US for anything to do with the oil industry were suddenly stuck, because everything, it was these relations they had with American companies, and they had to pivot to other parts of the world. There's a history of the heavy manufacturing and heavy industries that Iran has had with the US, and it's moved to Germany, it's moved to Italy, it's moved to Russia. People still do want to engage with the US, and if we keep imposing sanctions, the Europeans, I don't think, are going to fall behind us, right? So we're basically going to isolate ourselves and isolate the American economy from the one country in the region that has a population of 70 million, educated, and the resources to buy, but or to do business with the US. But
Professor Mearsheimer?
Regarding your question about how Trump is likely to get along with Congress, the key thing to remember about Trump is that he ran against Washington. He ran against the foreign policy community.
Ran against Ted Cruz and John McCain. Yeah, I know he ran against all.
So now he becomes president, and he has to appoint a whole slew of people to important positions. But he is an outlier, and he has very few people who think like he does. And there's no way he can help but fill up this administration with all sorts of people who think about the world the way the foreign policy community here in Washington does. And then when you take into account that we have this deep state.
And Elliot Cohen just told all of them not to join on today in the Post. So
we know, you know better than I do how opportunistic most people are here in Washington, and how they will jump at an opportunity to occupy a high-level position. But the point is that almost all of those people will have very different views than Donald Trump. They will not be deal makers. They will not view NATO the way he does, and so forth and so on. So the $64,000 question is, how much agency do you think Trump has in the face of these powerful structural forces that are going to be arrayed against him? And I think that over time, Donald Trump will be a much less radical president than most people think he will be now, at least in terms
I think
of foreign
the interesting
policy.
scenario to play out is whether Trump is able to get enough Republicans to find their deep realist core not to be supportive of the sanctions process, but then whether Chuck Schumer draws Democrats in as a way to bash Trump and they become the champions of sanctions.
That may very well happen. But
Isn't part of this is to me an unknown. I mean, to what degree is the hostility toward the Iran nuclear deal on the part of congressional Republicans a function of them seeing it as Obama's deal,
right?
Everything Obama has done is hateful. Well, guess what? As of January 20th, the Obama era has ended, and Republicans are now in power, and suddenly the issue looks somewhat differently. I mean, many people have noted that already, it appears, sort of thinking about the Affordable Care Act is sort of changing.
Trump care.
But I mean, the notion.
Such a thing possible.
We're gonna
Rebranding.
This legislation that the Republicans have repeatedly tried to revoke, now they're going to be able to revoke it. Well, let's find out what happens. So things are going to look different for the Republican Congress once they own all these problems, it seems to me.
Fascinating. Raise it, you wanted to?
There's one particularly interesting aspect that builds off of what you and John were talking about. The foreign policy establishment in this city does oftentimes take a particular view on Iran-related issues. But there are some people that, especially on the GOP side, that haven't. So I would be interested to see, if it's within the realm of possibility, how likely Trump surrounds himself inside of the White House institutionally with people who he trusts to go out and do the kinds of things he wants to do, and then kind of quarantine off the State Department, quarantine off the Defense Department, and make it a very White House-centric process, kind of like what Obama has done second term, but on steroids. So, for example, Zalmay Khalilzad is somebody who's come out very publicly and said we should be talking to the Iranians, we should be working with the Iranians. It's very Obama-esque, and everything he's written over the past couple of months.
He was my dark horse that I thought would get the Secretary of State nod.
Yeah, and so if he doesn't,
Trump at the Center for National Interest speech
Exactly.
that Trump gave, and has been out there in a very different place than John Bolton on Iran. And so I'm glad you mentioned his name, because he is a name to watch. He is lurking out there waiting for the call, letting everyone kill each other in this first phase. But
Right.
you know, it is interesting. Let me open up to the audience. Trina Parsi, you know something about this report, I take it.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you all for a fantastic conversation. I wanted to see if I could bring it to a global context. That the Iran
I'll give you a
deal,
mic so you can be heard online.
The Iran deal was quite closely linked to the pivot to Asia.
Right.
In order to be able to fulfill this pivot, and we can debate as to whether that's good or bad, or whether it happened or not, it was important to be able to eliminate the biggest risks that could drag the United States back into a major war in the region. And the biggest risk was the Iranian nuclear program. So it was necessary to be able to resolve this in order to be able to fulfill the global objective of pivot to Asia. Now, what is your assessment as to whether this is an objective of the Trump administration, or a likely objective of the Trump administration, or whether pivot to Asia is completely dead at this point, and as a result, will that have an impact on the strategic perspective on Iran, assuming that this is going to be an administration that thinks in strategic terms?
John?
Assuming that the administration thinks in strategic terms, there is going to be a pivot to Asia. The rise of China represents the rise of a potential peer competitor. And the United States focuses laser-like on potential peer competitors when they appear on the horizon. It was true during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. It was clear before that with both Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and before that with Imperial Germany. So there's going to be a pivot to Asia, no questions asked. The problem we face is not just the Middle East, it's also in Europe. Instead of pivoting out of Europe to Asia, what we've done is moved further into Eastern Europe. That was the conversation we've had before, which slows down any pivot. Furthermore, we've gotten involved in a war against ISIS, which further slows down the pivot to Asia. If we were to pick a fight with Iran and engage in a major war with them, that would even make the situation worse and would make no strategic sense at all. But as you know, the United States has demonstrated over the past 15 years that doing things that make no strategic sense is part of our playbook.
I just, so, we've spent a lot of time talking about, the Iran deal, good, bad, what is it working? My question to the John Boltons of this world is, what is your alternative? What's your alternative vision of where we?
He's articulated it.
But yeah, exactly. But hang on. But let's understand, what does regime change actually mean? Who is going to do regime change? Who is going to come out of that? Because the Iranian public does not want regime change. They have said it over and over again. They don't want chaos.
No, I've heard John Bolton very directly articulate a very clear vision.
Exactly, but that's his. I'm just saying that who is.
You may disagree with it. But
No, but it's not just that I disagree with him. It's that he and many of the others that we're talking about, Giuliani and others.
Right.
I don't know whether John Bolton per se, but Giuliani and others have been, paid by the MEK to be part of a discourse around Iran, right? So So let's step back and just say, okay, so you want, let's say, you want regime change.
Should also add, just for fairness, editorially, Howard Dean to that.
Yes, exactly, absolutely. I know, there are plenty of others that could be in this. But you want regime, what does regime change look like? How well have we done with regime change in Iraq, in Libya, and elsewhere? It's chaos. You don't know what's going to happen out of it. And again, taking the Asia vision, you have Pakistan right next door with a lot of Talibs, a lot of craziness, and a bunch of nuclear weapons. And you have Iran, which is actually the border between that and the rest of the Middle East. Now, you want a country that's going to become chaotic and open that pathway and those borders become risky? That's one thing to question. The second thing is, let's say regime change is, you forget regime change, you want to impose sanctions to really squeeze the Iranians in a way to get regime change. You're only going to radicalize the Iranian public against the United States. For 30 years, they've moved away from being radicalized against the United States. You're just going to hand it over to them. So we should, that's the question you should be asking, not about whether the deal is real.
But there is no strategic argument for regime change. There's a theological argument. The theological argument is one that insists that we are the sole superpower, and we are the indispensable nation. There is no alternative to American global leadership, and that arguably it has to be demonstrated in a place like Iran.
Well, let's get some more questions there, but one thing I want to say to Trita is that Shinzo Abe of Japan is trying really hard to get through that Trump Tower phone bank. And because regardless of what John just shared, and I think in the long run John is probably right, and I think Obama's bet was the Middle East looks like a sinkhole for U.S. lives, U.S. money that brings nothing back. Asia is where the future of the global middle class will be. You have to be embedded in there. TPP was a carrier for that. And what the problem with the TPP thing is there are very few business leaders who were actually agitating for it, but lots of generals and admirals were, because they saw it more as a strategic holding place vis-a-vis China. So it raises this interesting question. Walking away from TPP, that then sends a shockwave through the region that Duterte is right, don't count on the U.S., and which squeezes Vietnam. And so I would simply say that despite my agreement with John long-term, there's going to be a short-term tsunami in Asia of doubt about America's willingness to be in the region. And I think it's going to be punctuated by TPP and the failure of that. And Shinzo Abe is freaking out about it right now on a whole variety of fronts. And China's doing absolutely nothing. It's all being done by others. I remember when the head of the policy planning staff in the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs told me that China's grand strategy was to try and keep America distracted in small Middle Eastern countries. And it's not good. But let me, we have a question right over here. Yes.
I'm Fee Mohtader. I'm a member of NIAC. Thank you, NIAC, for putting this outstanding panel of discussion. My question is to Mr. Vesowich. On the book that you wrote about limits of power, first of all, you're my icon, and thank you for being here today. You wrote in the book that there is a apparatus in Pentagon who are a bunch of ideologues, and they promote wars, and they try to engage the United States into unnecessary wars. And with the possibility of John Bolton and more hawkish people like Giuliani in this new administration, and as you know, we Iranians believe in conspiracy theory, as always. Do you think that there's still a possibility of a bunch of people in Pentagon promoting war and promoting regime changes? Thank you.
Andy,
well,
plug for your book.
Yes, it's a different book. There is a national security apparatus that includes not only people who work for the government, but sort of this larger foreign policy establishment to include think tanks, congressional staffers, many, I think, mainstream journalists. They are powerful. They are committed to maintaining their power and influence, and that's why one of the interesting things we're going to see here is what happens to the drain the swamp rhetoric. I mean, he did run against the establishment in both parties, and Trump has led his supporters to expect that.
But then he hired Grants Priebus and
precisely. So they expect him to deliver on draining the swamp, and yet there are early indications that the residents of the swamp are already finding their way into this new administration. My guess is that the foreign policy establishment will prevail, will survive. And I think that there's good news and there's bad news in that. I think on balance, establishment views are likely to favor the fulfillment of the Iran nuclear deal. That said, the foreign policy establishment is so devoid of creativity, of the capacity for critical thought,
Can I just challenge that for a minute? You know, as a member of that establishment, you know, I look at it differently. I mean, I think we're talking about the establishment too monolithically. There's been a competition between the neoconservatives and liberal interventionists and liberal internationalists. Anne-Marie Slaughter has been out there, and Bob Kagan and others. But I just want to say, I'm saying that what's interesting to me about this moment we're in is the realist school, which used to dominate the scene, has largely atrophied, and there's not been a lot of younger generation signups for that. I was listening to Rand Paul on MSNBC this morning saying, you know, basically realists are back, but there's not a big pipeline of them. And so it's really interesting to think about, because what we're talking today essentially is about a realist approach. John is a realist, Andy, I think you're a progressive realist, in this kind of notion about what to bring in. It really raises this interesting question. You know, when the Brent Scowcrofts of the world were there, I wrote a piece on saying there's nobody, you know, nobody beneath them, and that if you go to things like the Scowcroft Center at CSIS today, not a lot of realists there. Oh, Atlantic Council, excuse me, Barbara. Yes, Atlantic.
Steve, what's the
Council.
difference between a realist and a pragmatist? Because you didn't. I'm
Oh,
not
there's
sure
a
that
very
I'm
big. There's a very big.
Right. So I'm a pragmatic idealist, right?
You're
Or an
pragmatic
ideal
idealist,
pragmatist.
yeah.
I'm not sure, but
John has a whole book on that.
Right. You know, the establishment, the folks that are dominating the discourse. I agree with you. There are lots of others that are involved in these spaces. They're not sitting in the think tanks, or if they are. In the last year.
My bigger point is an opportunity. I think a bigger opportunity for debate than we've had in a long time.
I agree, and I wish that they would look at.
I emphatically agree with that. The debate is not going to happen within Washington.
Right.
It seems that Washington's predisposition is to curtail debate.
Can we get Ray McGovern and
but
Barbara?
the mood of the moment in the country,
Yeah.
I think, is one that would welcome a broad debate over foreign policy, and it'll especially welcome that debate if it turns out that Trump fails to deliver on his drain the swamp premise.
I get Ray here, and Ray, you get the answer, Ray. So Ray.
I am Ray McGovern.
We're going to give you a mic.
Okay.
I thought you were a pro, man.
Ray McGovern, veteran intelligence professionals for sanity. I've watched Russia for 5 decades now, so my question comes out of that. And this notion about that John mentioned, Ukraine, Syria, and Iran. Now, I would have said Ukraine, Eastern Europe, and Syria, but I think you're right, John. You know, I think if you look at what's happened, all of us tend to kind of be saturated with propaganda that we have an expansionist Putin. There is not one scintilla of evidence that Putin ever intended or expected to have to take over the Crimea, if that's the way you want to put it, okay? It was the 22nd, not the 23rd of February, the 22nd when we mounted a coup in Kiev, which I was just back from Germany. The German Foreign Office says, no, there was no coup there. There was no coup there. Well, there was a coup there. George Friedman called it the most blatant coup in the history of mankind, and he's right. So my point is simply this, that when you say, Steve, that talk about paranoia in the Baltics, and you said justified in part, no, it's not justified. It's all synthetic, it's all contrived, and Americans would be shocked to hear that. And that's why I will never get on CNN or any other place, about which we were warned as early as 2008, when Lavrov called Burns in and said, do you know what "niet" means? "Niet" means "yet," and that means "niet," the red line against Ukraine and Georgia entering NATO. So I'd just like to kind of make that point, because even in this august assembly, there's a creeping in of Russian expansionism.
Thank you, Ray. We'll have coffee and discuss it sometime. Let me go to Barbara again. Barbara Slater.
Thanks. Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council, proud home of the Brent Scowcroft Center, among other things, and the Future of Iran Initiative. I wanted to ask, particularly Reza and Sanam, how they think Iran is going to play this. The campaign was a godsend for those who said American democracy was a fraud, and we don't need that here. We have elections coming up. Rouhani has to run. Is this whole Trump phenomenon going to doom Rouhani? Is he going to be able to survive it? What's your sense of how they're going to handle this? Thanks.
Reza?
I think that you're going to see a lot of bark, but not a lot of bite. Meaning, I think most Iranian officials across the political spectrum, and the majority, if not the entirety, of Rouhani's coalition, which is largely held together over the 3+ years of his presidency, have a long-standing track record of being reactive rather than proactive. Let's wait and see what they do, and then we can base our strategic calculations accordingly. A big part of trying to do the JCPOA was to try and improve relations across the board. And if that included the United States, so be it. If not, then it demonstrates to the rest of the world that the problem is in Tehran, or excuse me, the problem is in Washington, not in Tehran. What Obama achieved was proving the inverse. The problem was in Tehran, not in Washington. So here we have a situation where if I was a betting man, I would bet you're going to see the Iranians sit tight, talk a lot, but not actually do anything. The worst thing, the absolute worst thing that the Iranians could do right now is another provocative action in the Persian Gulf. The worst thing that they could do is detain another dual national Iranian American. Because all that does is reinforce bad behavior and send a message that frankly doesn't need to be sent right now. They need to be looking for ways to get out of the corner that they've boxed themselves in on these kinds of things, not continue to double down on it. And I'd like to think that even people in Iran's military and intelligence establishment understand that, because if it's past this prologue, it demonstrates that they do understand.
And I just quote John Mearsheimer that they too have an incredible ability to do irrational things.
Indeed.
So, yeah.
So I think that, well, first of all, we just don't know. I mean, I think with Iran, one of the things that we must learn, and we all know, is that you just don't know what's going to happen. But I think that the disappointment around the fact that the economic benefits of the sanctions really haven't been met, and things are still pretty bad, is something to be conscious of. Now, whether, as Reza says, they're going to, the regime writ large is going to look at this and say, we're going to put other players in and we're going to go hard line as well, or whether Rouhani is going to, carry the vote. I would like to think that we would still carry on with a Rouhani administration. I don't know. I've learned that I'm, as an Iranian citizen, a British citizen, and an American resident, in all 3 cases I've been wrong: Brexit, Trump, and so I refuse to put to bet anymore, because I think I'm becoming an endangered species in terms of my views on these issues.
Just for the record, I just want to say how I love the Scowcroft Center, and the Scowcroft Center leadership was in Saudi Arabia yesterday, I think, because I was flying back from Abu Dhabi, and it would be very interesting for you guys to put on a program based on their findings on Iran with respect to this report and what it proposes. So to get a review, so just a thought, since you helped run that place. Yes, right there. We have a microphone for you, but I'm going to ask you to be brief because we're running out of time.
I just wanted to say that much of the discussion here, and probably the report that I have read, is the perspective is what is in the national interest of Iranians, of Americans. Unfortunately, the world would have been much better if that was really how the world works. We have to look at what is in the interest of the people who are running the show in Iran and in the US. And it seems to me that much of the foreign policy of the US toward Iran has been driven lately what is preferred in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu and his clique. And that's what is going to probably have the most impact on how in the next couple of months we are going to see what happens to the nuclear deal, etc. Congress is just preparing to pass another set of sanctions under the guise of human rights and ballistic missiles and whatnot. And with these players, it's going to pass. And it seems to me that the nuclear deal would essentially die on wine. If not, that the Iranians would see that there is no, with the sanctions, there is no economic benefits. Therefore, why should they hold their end?
How I would respond, I want to give the panel an opportunity to, is to say that significant parts of the Israeli national security establishment that support this Iranian deal. So I think it's a mistake, when you think about whether the deal survives or doesn't survive, what this report does is it tries to advise U.S. policymakers on what the best U.S. policy options are across the board. But to argue today that Israel is uniformly opposed to the Iran deal, I think is a mistake, given what we've seen. So I just want to make sure that we're not, jumping up with kind of over, cliches to some degree about players and positions. John?
A couple points. One is, it's not just the Israelis, it's also the Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia. Second is, you want to distinguish between the deal and improved relations over time. And the Saudis, as someone just pointed out, are in favor of maintaining the deal. And I see no evidence that the Israelis want to undo the deal, at least at this point in time. But I think what the Israelis want and what the Saudis want is to make sure that there's no significant improvement in relations over time, as is laid out in the report.
But you can't have, you see that you can't.
What happens if the sanctions pass? And essentially the economic, there is very no path deals with business, even with Europeans. I mean, Airbus deal has not gone through because US has not given them assurances. If the Airbus cannot have a deal, what are the chances for Boeing?
Yeah, so the concern that you raise on sanctions is a very real concern. And it's a concern that will go from the Obama administration and be passed on to the Trump administration. And you're right that Congress is a bit more aggressive as it pertains to sanctions-related issues than the executive branch has a propensity to be. Fortunately, the numbers in the Senate are still reasonably good to believe that they wouldn't be able to override a presidential veto. So it's not going to be easy to pass just any sanctions. It depends on the actual details of the sanctions legislation that comes through. And if sanctions legislation has aspects that are clear violations of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, a compelling case can be made to senators on both sides of the aisle. You would be abrogating American commitments and all of the consequences that were earlier discussed would then apply. So it remains to be seen, but it's a possibility.
Yes, right here in the back. In the back.
Let me just add to this. The existing agreement involves sanctions relief, so let alone the new sanctions. So the fact that the Israelis and the Saudis want the deal to stay as it is, but they don't want it, you can't have your cake and eat it. From the Iranian side, the relief of economic sanctions was part of the deal. And if we're not seeing it, then it's going to be seen as the U.S. reneging, which is how it's
Yes.
So my question is more about Iranian domestic politics. When Khatami was the president of Iran in the early 2000s, he reached out to the George W. Bush administration, was swatted away, and the reaction was, Ahmadinejad becomes president, we ramp up our uranium enrichment. So worst case scenario, say this deal falls apart. I think of all the hardliners in Iran, and Ahmadinejad is kind of on the outs now. Who is that next kind of hardliner? Is it Soleimani, General Soleimani? That could be the, to the supreme leader's next kind of reaction to.
Do a quick response from Ray on that, since we're not really talking about Iran and more about.
Yeah, the dynamic you describe is very real. Nailing it down to who the specific individual could potentially be, trying to predict Iranian politics is a very humbling experience. Nobody saw Ahmadinejad coming until weeks before the actual election took place. So you're right, the ideological thrust in terms of Iran being reactive, but there's also another scenario, which is if these guys if the Rouhanis and the Zarifs and others get emasculated again, if the United States pulls the rug out from under them again and we have another axis of evil moment, they're not going to go into the wilderness, they're going to rally with everybody else, and then we're going to have a more hardline Iranian system across the board, and that's the worst possible outcome.
You're going to have the population.
And the people, yeah.
Well, I want to thank, fascinating discussion. Congratulations, Reza, and team on your report. I look forward to seeing how it's received. It's already been written up today, I think, in the New York Times, if I'm right. So big round of applause to John Mearsheimer, Sanam Naragi Angelini, Andy Basevich, thank you guys.
Millions of